I'm helping the Pakistani Federation find some players with experience because they're going to play in the World Baseball Classic qualifier down in Panama City. And I said, are you telling me just over the phone that you're going to put me on the national team if I agree to like get my body and my arm in shape? And he's like, can you? I said, how can I not now?
Yeah. Mom or dad was Pakistani. What about mom? Was she from the States? Or?
Yeah, my mom's from Buffalo, New York.
Okay.
She moved down to Dallas with her sister in the 70s.
Okay.
Like Dust Bowl 70s. There was jobs here. There was no jobs there. So she came down, and my dad was managing a restaurant. So and my mom was a teller at a bank. And so I always tell the story about how my parents met is like my dad would walk into the bank literally with bags of cash, and of course, that gets a female's attention.
Yeah. Well, it was his cash too, right?
Some of it, yeah.
Heck yeah, man. And the rest is history. How long have they been together?
They've been together, I'm 38, so they've been together 42 years now, I think it is. Yeah. They live in the same house I was brought home to in Mesquite, Texas.
Mesquite, Texas, baby.
Yep.
That's cool, man. That's how my grandparents were. I think they built their house. I mean, they're obviously since passed, but they built their house in, I want to say, the 50s or 60s. Literally lived in that house till they both passed away.
Yeah.
Like 50 some odd years. Built it for like $15,000.
Yeah.
Just crazy difference in economics.
My dad grew up in the third world, so he's the least materialistic person you'll ever come across. And I remember being like an 8 or 10-year-old kid, and my dad was like, hey, son, I paid off the house. And even back then, I knew that was uncommon. But he's had that house paid off for, God, at least 25 years.
Yeah.
And the neighborhood's kind of gone downhill a little bit, but he doesn't care. They're comfortable there, and they're 45 minutes from us, so they'd make the drive to see their grandkids.
Did they do the grandkid? They watch them quite a bit?
Yeah.
What about your wife's parents? Are they here local too, or no?
So my wife's mother is here. She's in the colony.
Okay.
And her dad is up in Indianapolis where they grew up. So she's got 3 siblings, and we're actually flying up there this weekend with the kids to go to the Indy 500. And
no kidding.
Yeah. We go every year. Yeah.
You go every year. Are you big into the racing scene? Or?
I am now that my family is. My father-in-law had been for like 40 straight years until COVID, and we went up. I think they canceled it in 2020, and so 2021 they did like a lottery for like limited seating. And we didn't get selected, so we ended up watching it from home. But those COVID years were the first 2 he had missed in literally 40 years.
Dang, man!
So it's a big time race fan.
Yeah, I had Carrie Niblack, who was she's now the president of Blackwell, which a competitive captive. But she has a racing lineage. Like her aunt was named Roxy. I forgot Roxy's last name. But her aunt was racing cars back in like the 60s or 70s or something like that, before female drivers were common. And she went over and like pursued a European career. Apparently, Carrie was saying that Roxy's was walked down the aisle or given away at her wedding by Mario Andretti. Like they were super close.
No kidding.
Yeah. Somebody gave her an engine at a race, and it was some famous racer. I can't remember who it was, but she's in Indianapolis, I believe, as well.
Yeah.
So like super into that world of racing.
Yeah, I've kind of gotten into it over the last couple of years. I have a friend who's a really prominent lawyer who's big into car collection and racing, and he actually bought Michael Schumacher's, I think it was 2001 or 2003, I don't remember which year, but he bought Michael Schumacher's F1 car that won the F1 series that year. And
I wonder what that thing is worth.
I know the numbers, they're crazy.
Yeah.
He actually just sold it and made like 5x on this car over 12 years. And I mean, there was an article in Car and Driver magazine, and this author clearly had a fanboy crush on this car because he said it was not just the coolest car that had ever been made, it may be the coolest thing that humans have ever made. And so
that might be a little bit of a stretch.
Yeah, maybe. But of course, my buddy was pounding his chest like, look what he's writing about my car.
Well, I think everybody's got that buddy that's either a little further in their career, a little more successful, that has the cars. And you're like, one day. Like that's, I hope.
Yeah. So, I mean, if that's your motivation.
Yeah, no, other people have different. Yeah, like I love the beauty of like just a well-engineered car whether it's because it physically looks beautiful or whether because it performs well or both. I just have always had a fascination since a kid. I remember you remember those old, what are those book fairs that you'd go to and you could spend $20 on books, but you'd come home with like 4 posters?
Yes, yes.
I loved the Lamborghini Countach, which was like, I think in the 80s or 90s, I think I had a purple Lamborghini Countach like poster on my wall, was saving up in a jar. I was saving up for Lamborghini at like eight years old, and then I think I got $100 in it, and was like, oh, that's how much Lamborghinis cost, and then bought GI Joes or something instead. Yeah.
No, I knew where you were going with that because we're roughly the same age, and I remember having like the yellow Lamborghini, the red Ferrari. Like I had probably 4 or 5 of those hanging in my room as well, and I'm not a huge car guy because you just tear them up. Like I'm a little boy at heart, so everything I touch, I tend to break, like my little kids. And so the idea of spending, $250,000 on a car just doesn't appeal to me. But who knows? Maybe one day I'll be there and I won't care about.
Yeah, I think there's folks that reach a certain echelon of income or wealth where that $250,000 is nominal, and so it's a little bit different.
So what would be your car then?
It's a great question. I don't know. I recently got into liking Porsches, like the Porsche 911. There's a really beautiful blue color they have that I've had my eyes on, but those are, just not even a turbo, just a regular 911.
Is it like that sky blue color?
It's sky blue.
I know what you're talking about.
There's the GT3 those are like a couple $100,000. Those are
I know what that
amazing.
is.
Yeah, but that's a little bit down the line.
yeah.
Well, before we go on further, let's go and introduce you, man, because we probably might use some of that. It was a great conversation, but I'm here with Omar Arif, who is what you said, SVP of Growth. Did I?
That's correct. Yeah.
For ClaimDOC, the wonderful ClaimDOC reference-based pricing vendor. Do you call yourselves a vendor, or what do you guys call yourselves? Manager. Or?
Yeah, I call us a network replacement solution, a cost containment vendor. I mean, you could ask me 10 times what we are, and I'd give you 8 different answers. But yeah, RBP is our flagship product.
Yeah, I was gonna say, so we'll use the kind of the common nomenclature until we dig into it a little bit further. But that's of course going to be the bulk of the conversation today. I did feature ClaimDOC about 2 years ago now, but this isn't really a realm within the ecosystem of self-funding that I've dug into enough, and I felt it was time to address this subject again. And really appreciate you coming on, man. I want to, before we get into all the stuff about academic learning of RBP, let's learn a little bit about you, man. So Omar, why don't you tell us your backstory, a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, I'm local. I'm 38 years old. I grew up in Mesquite, Texas. I've got a wife and 2 kids. We live in Highland Village now, so we moved from the east side to the north side. I spent most of my college career at TCU, so I know Fort Worth as well.
Baseball player, right?
That's correct. Yeah, baseball player my whole life. Well, every sport under the sun until about middle school, and then basketball, football until 9th grade, and then straight baseball through college and a short stint in the minor leagues. Yeah.
Yeah, and you told me we were having coffee beforehand, and I always like to get to know folks. You and I have known each other, I guess, for a couple of years now. Found out we had a mutual connection, but then I didn't really know your full story of baseball. You said you got to play in Germany, right, as like a player-coach sort of deal?
Yeah, it was funny because it was 2008, and I realized I wasn't going to make millions of dollars playing Major League Baseball, and I got a random call from a guy in Germany saying, hey, we need an American to come play on our men's team and help sort of be the assistant coach for the men and then be the head coach for the youth team. And I didn't know what to make of it because I didn't know the Germans played much baseball.
How did they find out about you? Like, where did they discover you or get your connection?
I don't even recall. I had a buddy whose friend did it, and I think I got connected through one of my minor league buddies, but I don't remember actually how they got a hold of me. But it ended up working out great. They put me up. I got paid. It was like a job. I got paid and got to experience that culture. I'd never been to Europe before, so it was a good time. And
what city?
I was in a little town called Doren, Germany, which is in the northern part of Germany. It's right in between Hamburg and Bremen.
Okay.
Really fun little town and fun culture.
Did you pick up German at all, or like here and there a little bit, or is everybody speaking English? 9.
It's hard because you go over there and they all speak 3 or 4 languages, so they'll just speak English to you. And so I was only there for about 3 months, and I didn't pick up much German at all. No, I'm from a language perspective and from a music perspective, I'm That's not my strong suit.
Yeah.
Let's just say that.
Well, you were telling me a little bit before, and I don't know if we'll keep that line of conversation or we'll cut off the intro to the podcast, but your father is from Pakistan, right? And moved to the States in the 70s. So you have the Pakistani heritage, and even said you played on the Pakistani national team for baseball. Pareto Health is the manager of the largest employee benefits group captive in the United States. And it's also now the main sponsor of the Self-Funded with Spencer podcast. I chose to partner with Pareto Health for three main reasons. Number one, their dedication to improving the world of health benefits. Number two, their mission to reduce volatility and to make self-funding simple for mid-sized employers. And number three, the strength and scale of their program. With over 2,300 member groups and more than $1 billion of stop-loss premium under management, Pareto Health is the most robust solution of its kind in the country, period. Stay tuned for more information because I'm sure I'll be featuring them on an episode of the podcast very soon. Visit Pareto Health at paretohealth.com or follow them on LinkedIn to stay up to date on the latest news and developments.
Yeah, and that was recent, and that was kind of another wild story where I got a random phone call. So this guy calls me out of the blue and says, I'm a scout for the Baltimore Orioles. And he said, I understand you played some pro ball over here and that you have a Pakistani background. And I said, yeah. Who is this? And he said, well, do you want to play for the Pakistani national team? I probably cussed at him and told him to, F off because I thought it was one of my buddies pranking on me or something because I haven't played competitive baseball in 15 years.
Yeah.
And he said, no, Omar, I'm helping the Pakistani Federation find some players with experience because they're going to play in the World Baseball Classic qualifier down in Panama City. And I said, are you telling me just over the phone that you're going to put me on the national team if I agree to get my body and my arm in shape? And he's like, can you? Said, how can I not now?
Yeah.
And so it was really cool. I got to represent my father's home country. I had a cousin who played college ball here as well that was on the team. And so it was a really cool experience to play with him because he's 8 years younger than me. We never played together before. And a lot of our family got to come down and watch the tournament.
So how long did it take you to get in shape for that, out of curiosity?
I had about 6 weeks to get it going.
And did you feel like you got yourself back? Probably not close to what you were in your 20s, but you feel like serviceable?
Serviceable. We'll say serviceable.
I use that word because I'm 40 now. If I tried to train 6 weeks to play soccer, I would be serviceable. I can move a little bit, but I'm probably way slower. My hips don't quite do what they used to do.
Yeah.
But I can trap a ball,
Yeah. So I pitched in a game. I came out of the bullpen against the Argentine national team, which thankfully they're better at soccer than they are at baseball. So I got our starter out of a jam, and then I went back out and walked a couple guys and ended up giving up a couple runs. So my stat sheet wasn't great, but I feel like it was a decent outing.
Dude, what a cool thing though, to get to say you did, right? Especially the way it transpired as well.
Yeah, it was.
So how did y'all do in the tournament? Just last question around that.
We lost both games we played, but Pakistan is an evolving baseball country. It's a cricket dominant country. They're top 3 in the world in cricket, and so to go over there and be competitive, we lost to Argentina 7-5, which is a fairly competitive game. We lost to Nicaragua 12-0. But the difference is on their 30-man roster, they had 21 professional baseball players.
Right.
On our 30-man roster, we had 0 professional baseball players. Right. And so we did okay. And for reference, in the prior qualifier, the Pakistani team didn't score a run in either game. So the fact that we were close in a game is progress.
That's cool, man.
Yeah.
It's super cool. I appreciate you sharing that story. I didn't even realize that until we sat down having coffee this morning. But obviously there was a point, even though this came later in life, there was a point after the German stint where you realized baseball wasn't in your future. I think, we've all had to come to that realization at some point or another. So what did you start doing for work right after that?
Yeah, I came back to Dallas in August of 2008. And most people our age or older realize what was going on in 2008. The financial markets had melted down, real estate was in the tank, and there wasn't a whole lot of good options for jobs, even in a great market like Dallas-Fort Worth. So I got connected to an insurance company through my college roommate.
Okay.
A gentleman named Bill Brooks interviewed me. I don't think he hired me on the spot, but it was pretty clear he wanted me to come work for him. So I went to work for Assurant Health selling small group, fully insured, on the John Alden paper that a lot of brokers still remember today. And it was a great learning experience because we were competing against the behemoth that is Blue Cross. and trying to convince brokers to sell our paper that they were less familiar with. So we had to get real creative with selling HSAs in the early days and HRAs. And so I cut my teeth doing that and learning on the fly. It was like, here's the phone, kid. Start making friends.
Yeah.
And I realized pretty quickly that sales was going to be a good path for me.
You said it wasn't necessarily the insurance component got you hooked, but it was the fact that you got the opportunity to sell that you really, really liked. So I think even probably that's a good thing that you were in a position selling something a little more challenging, right? That you had to develop because some more of those soft skills and understand how to overcome objections, or, if you're going up against a behemoth, right? You got to be a little bit better salesman, a little smarter to be able to sell against a name like Blue Cross. So do you feel like that shaped your career? That was a good place to start?
Without question. I still talk about it today with friends and colleagues that I knew from back then. And anytime I'm talking to people and they ask me what I do and I say I'm in the insurance business, they immediately think, oh my God, that's so boring. But man, like, it's a people business. Selling is selling, and it's all about relationships and building your expertise as you go. And so, yes, selling against the behemoths is what I figured out I like doing, because I have a contrarian nature. And so being able to sort of craft a message in a way that is going to help your brokers or your prospects see your side of things is really fun for me.
But I think it's cool too when you understand that your product solves a problem, right? Like, you understand it's different than the sort of status quo type product. You said you're contrarian. That's a word that they use a lot at Pareto, and I think even one of our captives is called contrarian. I'm new.
Nice.
Forgive me. I don't know everything about the organization yet, but I like that mentality, because to me, contrarian or counterculture or anything that goes against the status quo suggests there's an identification that status quo is not solving a particular problem, or there's a void, there's a need there. And so that contrarian mentality is you're going to go try to solve that problem instead. And I think that's fun. I think that's where you find where those opportunities arrive. So was it so much that your contrarian personality found this product, or your contrarian personality was able to come out because you were selling that type of product? Yeah,
maybe a little bit of both. That's a great question. I think it's probably both.
Okay.
But this portion of the industry, this alternative self-funding world, can get in your blood, and it's certainly gotten in mine. I absolutely love what I do. I love disrupting the status quo. I love competing against the Bucas of the world, and I love disrupting the system that I think doesn't serve the working class. I mean, it just doesn't. I mean, people talk all the time about how healthcare is broken. I don't think it's necessarily broken. I think the free market dictates what people will tolerate, and so it's only broken if we broke it. So it's our job to sort of correct it where we can, and so that's what we aim to do for the employers and the employees that.
I would say no, I don't even know if it's broken. I think it's just working as advertised, as designed, not necessarily advertised, but as designed. And so the crux of it is do you like the way it's designed or not? And I would argue that I dislike the way it's been designed. And so you and I both kind of bet our career and bet our futures on attacking that, or at least working against that. Whether or not we win, who knows? But I think with a clear conscience, what I do on a daily basis, I'm happy about the role that I play.
I would agree, and yeah, I like what you said. It's designed. It's working the way it was designed, intended to work, and thankfully we live in a free country with a free market, and it's up to the free market to decide to do it a better way.
Right.
I mean, if we think the government's going to bail us out, we're sadly mistaken. Without being political, I'll say that Obamacare maybe had some really good intentions, but without a doubt, I don't think anybody could argue that Obamacare has led to cost increases, which that is the opposite of what it was intended to do. Right. So, anybody thinks that local, state, or federal government's going to come save the day as it relates to healthcare is just that's wishful thinking.
Well, and I do think there's usually surface level good intentions that you perceive, I can see why they did this, or that makes sense. But what always happens is the unintended consequences when the thing fully plays out. It usually has the inverse impact. When regulation and government gets involved, I'm with you too. I think private sector, it's our responsibility, whether we're efficient at it or not, it's our responsibility to try to go fix these things or correct the things around those regulations. So when did you enter the world of RBP though? Let's kind of move forward and then we'll start that conversation. So reference-based pricing, when did you discover this thing?
So I first heard about it in early 2019 when I was called by a recruiter who was looking for sales talent to go work for ELAP, which is now Imagine 360. So I went to work for ELAP in May of 2019.
Did you know what it was at that time when that recruiter called you?
I did not.
You didn't? Okay.
I did not.
So what sold you at least on the concept, at least in 2019?
It sounded interesting. I called a few brokers that I had close relationships with and sort of pre-vetted it out as best I could. And I like the sound of it. It's a contrarian way of doing things. It generates a ton of value and savings for the employers that they serve. And I went ahead and made the jump, and things were going really well there. I realized that it was a product that I liked in an industry that I liked. And I got off to a really great start with those guys. And about a year into it, ClaimDOC came knocking on my door, and they presented me with just a life-changing opportunity that I couldn't pass up. And so after 14 months, I made the jump from ELAP to ClaimDOC, and that was August of 2020. So coming up on 3 years.
Okay, yeah. So you were selling reference-based pricing solutions too in the middle of the pandemic, which I'm sure we'll unpack a little bit of whether that was a good or a bad thing for your business. But before we proceed down the path, I think because I don't cover this a lot, and I don't think it's a niche solution, but it's not something that everybody in our ecosystem understands. So before we proceed, why don't we kind of define what we mean by reference-based pricing? And I know you said that's a component of what you do, so add on to what the rest of what ClaimDOC does as well. But let's start with just the definition of what we mean when we say RBP.
Yeah, reference-based pricing, it's establishing a benchmark for paying claims. And that's another question I get asked a lot, and I probably answer it 10 different ways every time. But reference-based pricing is a fair and reasonable way to pay providers. Okay. It's a pricing mechanism. Think of it as, instead of taking a certain price, you're dictating a certain price in order to make that price more fair and reasonable, and generate quality financial outcomes for yourself as an employer and also for your employees.
Well, and explain what the reference is, because that reference means it's referencing something which is
the reference is Medicare. Usually, if there's no Medicare equivalent, then we'll use AMA guidelines. Mm-hmm. We'll also use cost, because every hospital that accepts Medicare has to report their cost of services to CMS. So we look at Medicare, we look at costs, we look at AMA guidelines for any claims that don't have a Medicare equivalent. So it's all of those things. And one of the things that most people don't realize is that reference-based pricing there's components of it in every single group health plan in the country, regardless of who the carrier is.
Okay.
All the big carriers use reference-based pricing for their out-of-network claims. All the big carriers pay physicians on Medicare plus a markup. So reference-based pricing is everywhere. So really what we're talking about doing is reference-based pricing across the entire plan. So we don't even call it reference-based pricing internally. We call it network replacement.
Network replacement.
Yes, sir.
Yeah. The network replacement, is that the full terminology? Is there an acronym? Because I know we love acronyms.
There's probably one coming, but for now we just call ourselves a network replacement
When I've heard
solution.
Value-based pricing or VBP before, I mean, again, it's just sort of slightly shaping or reshaping the idea, but I think the concept, the crux of what it is still the same, which is using that reference point and then adding in a margin or a spread, if you will, if we're going to get in the PBM world, and say, this is what we'll pay you instead. In theory, the idea, though, is that what will pay you instead is far less of what is a negotiated paid amount with a PPO contract or equivalent like that, right? Is my understanding correct?
That is correct. It's bottom up, so it's bottom plus a markup versus top down, because everybody who's in this space, any benefits professional, knows that the top down approach leads to inflated reimbursement rates, and now it's to the point where those reimbursement rates at the hospital level are greater than 3 times Medicare across the country. Not only that, but the creative billing practices of the health systems create, even even greater cost for the employers and the employees.
I like how you
serve.
use the word creative. I feel like that's a diplomatic way to say they're overcharging for claims.
I'm being a little bit PC because I know this is going to be.
I understand. Yeah. No, you got to toe the line. I totally get that, man. But so why don't we, let me ask you this, and then I want to start going into some more technical details because I want folks to really understand what this solves. But the ClaimDOC solution in of itself, like what is the difference point? What do you guys feel you do better? Like tell me about your solution in reference, not a benchmark against other vendors, but what you do well and why you guys think you have the best solution.
Yeah, there's a few things there, and I could talk on that topic for a while.
Yeah, that's
so
fine. Don't feel
brief.
like you have to avoid getting into specifics if you want.
Sure. I think the biggest differentiator that we have is that we're a family-owned boutique company. That is not the norm in my space with regard to competition. It's mostly private equity or venture capital backed firm. There's a couple firms that are part of a publicly traded entity, and that's all well and good. I'm not saying that's always a bad thing, but when you're dealing with a service that has such a high intensity of labor, meaning you have to have a really beefed up service model to make it work, it doesn't work well if you have a stripped down service model or you're running a skeleton crew because you have to deliver returns to your outside investors. I work for our founder who's still our CEO, and he's, I call him a redneck because he is one. He's a redneck that drives a used Ford pickup truck, and he's not that fancy, and we can operate on a little bit thinner margins in order to make sure that our customers are taken care of. And that shows. That shows really quickly when people have done RBP with some of our competitors and then they do it with us. And just to give you an example, like we have about 120 employees, and just about half of those people are member facing. They're there to ensure that members have access to care outside of a traditional contract, and then they're also there to handle any sort of billing questions that pop up.
Well, and that's always been the rub, right? Or at least the early versions of reference-based pricing is that there was concerns over balance billing, right? Was obviously the most common objection or concern. But, there was sort of this unknown. It's because, I don't have a network, so what happens and how do I navigate this? So talk to me about maybe some of the early iterations of this versus how it's evolved. Or you said, I think it started in 2007 was the origination of RBP?
To my knowledge, GPA, Group and Pension here in town, and ELAP sold Bill Miller Barbecue down in San Antonio. That's the first full RBP case that I'm aware of.
Okay.
And that was 2007, yeah. Mm-hmm.
So it's still a relatively new-ish solution in the grand scheme of things. So.
Sure, yeah. I mean, it was 2007, so we're talking 16 years now. So there's been obviously a lot of trials and tribulations throughout that 16 years, but there's firms that have gotten smarter. I think, we're one of them. We've gotten smarter about how we transition people from PPO to reference-based pricing, and there's a number of things we do there as well. We've got a program that we call Pave the Way, which we actually trademarked. But Pave the Way is just a series of proactive outreaches that we do to the providers that the group already sees. So we do that two ways. One, we'll take a top utilization report and we'll start reaching out to the providers. And then two, we give the members the opportunity during open enrollment and then ongoing forever, we'll give them the opportunity to tell us who their providers are that they want to see.
Yeah.
And we'll do the outreach. And it's a really friendly conversation when I say, hey, Dr. Jones, Spencer's coming off of United and he's coming on to our open access program. Here's how we're going to pay you. Here's how quickly we're going to pay you. Will you file claims? Here's the payer ID. Here's what the card looks like. It's a really smooth transition. And if you think about what that does for us, it gets all the high utilizers who are already a little bit uncomfortable with the change because they see 3, 4, 5, 6, 10 doctors. It gets them comfortable with making sure with their access to care. So we set them up with all their docs, and then they also know that they've got a dedicated member advocate in their back pocket that they can use for any sort of questions that pop up.
Well, and that's one of the things I liked about, I sat down with Patrick a long time ago. And it's one of the things I liked about the story he was telling is that the old way, I guess, if you will, was you pay them and tell them take it or leave it, and then be willing to fight that in court with a balanced bill, right? Or be a little bit more adversarial in nature. And it's fine. It was a way to go about it, but then it left, sort of a lot more of a gray area and unknown for the member. You guys seem to take a softer approach, a more proactive approach to ensure that those providers are already on board prior to ever seeing a claim filed that way, right?
ClaimDOC is a medical claim auditing and member advocacy company. We provide fiduciary services to employer-sponsored benefit plans and allowing them to create an environment where we ensure that the benefit plans are being charged in a fair and reasonable basis.
My business is basically people, and it become a real simple transition. We thought it was going to be far more complex. I've saved, we'll say, hundreds of thousands of dollars. I could not say enough about ClaimDOC.
Yeah, so there's really two ways to do there's two primary ways to do RBP. One is pay and defend. You pay the claim, you think it's fair and reasonable, and then you defend that claim. And the other way is to negotiate and settle. Mm-hmm. And so, the old model of ELAP was pay and defend. They've come up with a softer approach. Some of the other competitors, they were negotiate and settle, which, it can be better for the member in certain scenarios, but it sets a bad precedent, and it also dilutes plan assets.
Yeah.
And so we find that we have a balance of both. We do all the legal work in-house. We have provider relations in-house. We have member services in-house. Like, we do everything under one roof. And so we have the ability to pay and defend. We have the ability to negotiate and settle. We have the ability to cut a single case agreement or a direct contract. And so we think our version of network replacement is the most buttoned up in the industry. And I would put our product up against anybody.
Well, I was talking to a broker just to kind of give you a kind of an analogy there, because there's a give and take on both directions, right? You can be completely adversarial and get the lowest price, or you can be kind of a pushover and still be reference-based pricing, but not really provide the savings that ultimately you're looking for. And I was having a conversation with a local broker, smaller agency that was maybe thinking about making a change to a bigger agency. And we were having this conversation about would he be able to do everything that he hopes to do or does today in his niche if he had the type of scale, or would there potentially be some compromise that needed to be made, but do it at a much bigger level for a lot more people. And I think you have to look at both sides of that equation. Yep. One's not necessarily better or worse. Do you want the most impact, even though it's slightly diluted, or do you want maximum impact for a small number of people? What's better? I mean, that's up to the individual to decide.
We play that game all day, every day, and we play that, and it's in a collaborative way, because we're looping in the consultant, we're looping in the plan sponsor and saying, hey, this example popped up last week. This lady needed some sort of female surgery. I don't know all the details, but it needed to be done. We didn't want to have care delayed. Mm-hmm. The facility was giving us a not so great single case agreement rate, and we found it to be just outside of plan guidelines where we normally would say, no, let's not do this. But because it was a sensitive female issue, the plan sponsor said, yeah, let's just go ahead and pay that claim, mm-hmm. and get this thing done. And so we try to be really thoughtful about how we do that, because we are dealing with people's health care.
Yeah, you still have to be conscientious of the member themselves, right?
Right.
Like, never can be lost in any of these equations.
Yeah, and I think the X factor for our plans when it comes to financial savings is the fact that we have a clinical team on staff, nurses and coding experts that perform a clinical audit on every single bill before we start to reprice the claim. And so when you look at how we talked about it earlier, the creative billing practices of these large health systems, they know that the big payers are auto adjudicating claims, even really, really large claims. And so just the fact that we audit it, I mean, my CEO will tell you that we're going to scrape off 25 to 30% of the dollars of any inpatient stay before we reprice the claim.
Wow. Before we
reprice the claim, because there's so much fraud, waste, abuse, whatever you want to call it. There's so much of that in the bill that we're just able to catch.
That's crazy, yeah. Well, let's talk about that, kind of the way that you adjudicate and the way that you get paid, because I think there's a couple different ways that you can go about it. Again, some give and take in the way that you go about it, but you guys don't really deploy the PEPM model, right? That's not a fixed cost. You guys do what, a percentage of savings instead?
We take a percentage of the bill charge,
okay.
Which is sort of faux pas. There's only a couple of vendors still doing that.
Why is it faux pas? Because they feel like people are making too much money
by doing
that? Okay,
correct.
Okay.
And the other competitors who don't do that have done a good job of saying these guys are making too much money, and so some brokers will tend to believe that. I think it's the only way to go, because it's more indicative of the work that you're doing. So I'll just give you a fake example. You bring me a 200 life case and nobody goes to the hospital for 6 months. Do you want to pay $30 PEPM to a vendor, or do you want to pay nothing to me because I haven't done anything yet?
Mm-hmm. Right.
That's the difference. But
But the balance of that equation, right, is that like caps or, making sure that there's not an unlimited upside of savings that you guys can make on any given claim.
Correct. Yeah. We cap ourselves out per claim so that we're not being egregious. And so, and that's also more friendly for our stop loss markets, because on these really big claims, they don't want to pay me $200,000 on one claim. That's not really fair. So we cap ourselves on big claims.
Yeah.
But the stop loss carriers that have taken the time to learn our model and have a couple of years or more experience with us, they'll give ClaimDOC decrements compared to some of the other vendors out there because they know how tight our claims management process is. So if you think about it from that perspective, my fees really don't matter, because you want to take the PEPM vendor, which adds to the employer fixed cost, when my stop loss rates are even less because the carrier knows that my claims management process is so buttoned up. You lose the higher fixed cost, you get the lower stop loss rate, and it's not that my fees are hidden or that we're trying to be, elusive about it. We're very transparent about the way we get paid. But it's just overall the financial outcome to the client is better. So I don't see why it's such a sticking point.
No, I don't think it is even a sticking point. I just think there are some solutions out there that don't place those caps on what they get paid on a per claim basis. And that's where you start looking at, well, wait, you made more money than anybody else in the equation. That doesn't seem appropriate, right? And so that's the balance, again, that you have to find what is the right way to massage it so that everybody looks at the equation and goes, that was appropriate, and that was appropriate, and we all win.
Yeah. And that's another thing is, like, there's scenarios where our fee is higher than the provider gets paid on a certain claim. And that doesn't sit right with a lot of people, but the only way that happens is if we catch all the fraud that was in the bill in the first place. And so it's like, well, our audit uncovered these things, and if we didn't do the audit, you would have paid X. And so
the inverse is do nothing and then just pay what was billed, or pay what the contract allowed, which is obviously a significantly higher multiple than what you did pay. So again, I mean, I think those are things just you hear in passing, right? Oh yeah, but X. And I think usually whenever there's any sort of soft objection like that, it's probably the result of somebody else marketing against you, or just a marketplace not being fully educated on it, and then it's very easy to address. And so I usually like to give folks an opportunity just to simply address those things head on, because what typically happens is you go, okay, that makes sense.
Well, we're about to really put an end to that conversation when we release our 2022 numbers. We're truing up and maturing out the claims, and we're doing a lot of analysis on not the discount numbers. We don't want to play the discount game, but the true cost, the cost per member per year, or the cost per employee per year, or the cost per family per year. And when we put those numbers out to the market, the fee conversation is going to go away, because people are going to see, wow, that's...
Well, sometimes it just simply takes a matter of a few years of building up the data to put out that white paper, then to prove in retrospect how well it worked. It does. Now the market gets to actually see that put out publicly.
Yeah, right? I mean, we have generally said for the last couple of years that depending on where you are geographically and how your plan is structured, we're going to save you 25 to 35% on your overall spend. And our 2022 numbers are looking like they're going to be far greater than 35%, like high 30s, maybe low 40s on average, when we compare them to the Kaiser Family Foundation's numbers that were recently published.
That's pretty astonishing, man.
Yeah, it's crazy.
Well, you said geographically, and I want to ask you, because we're located in North Texas, the Dallas area, for those that are listening that aren't aware. But I realize there are certain geographies, right, that a reference-based pricing arrangement or an open network arrangement just simply hasn't caught on or doesn't work because there's so much provider pushback, or there's maybe some monopolies or duopolies of systems in those locations. So what happens in a geographic area when you just can't do it? And maybe tell me why that's the case.
There are a couple really tricky markets. I won't call any of them out publicly, but anywhere where there's a dominant system that has the majority of the hospitals and probably also some of the providers is typically going to be tough. So you think about that, and it's a lot of rural markets, and then even some big markets where there's just one behemoth system that is like, no, we're not going to allow anybody in. And we have clients in some of those regions, and what we do there is we go out and we try to contract with as many freestanding ambulatory surgical centers as we can so that people have access to care, and then the emergency room is fine because of the Consolidated Appropriations Act. The ERs and anything attached to that can't balance bill the member, and they can't turn care away. And so there's some workarounds. Our provider relations team calls it a plan B, But there's certainly areas that are more challenging than others. I think a lot of that is broker perception more than anything else. Like, you know, in Dallas-Fort Worth, there's not a ton of brokers that are bought into the RBP concept, and that might have been from some heartburn that happened 10 years ago. So it's not easy. I'll never say it's easy. There's always going to be challenges, but from our viewpoint, the type of savings that are generated and the type of member experience we can deliver for 95% of the group is worth the headaches and the noise that we're going to hear on.
Yeah, I mean, especially if that, you know, that 35-ish% number actually bears itself out, like broadly, or maybe higher, right? Like you go, well, for 40% plan savings, I think I could deal with just a little bit of noise and a little education. And I do think it comes down to making sure the member is aware, because some employers will self-fund and their membership has no idea, right? Because there's nothing that really they interface with that is different than being fully insured.
Right.
I think it does a disservice to the members as well as the employer to not be a little bit more forthcoming about that, because that lets them know, hey, I actually am an active participant in the outcome of this plan. Money, you know, the cost of my plan is going to go up or down based on some of my own behavior and the way that I use the system. So I think with RVP, you kind of have to be open and upfront, right, in the way that you educate members?
Yeah, we would never even allow a broker to sell our program without getting buy-in from the plan to do that type of education, because it would, I mean.
Well, you touched on it earlier. I'd love to talk about, let's say I'm a group. I don't know if you can use a fully insured to all the way to RBP example or a self-funded with a PPO to RBP. I don't care, but talk to me about what it's like to sort of flip that switch and prepare the population now to interface with the healthcare system that way.
Yeah, it's an all hands on deck approach. I mean, we have an internal marketing team that builds out custom employer communication. Our dedicated implementation team is there, you know, 2 to 3 months prior to the effective date, because we want to have a part in open enrollment and the communication that goes out to the members. So it's, you know, I say all hands on deck because some people still enroll on paper. Some people enroll on their payroll system. Some people have a standalone Ben admin. And so, you know, everything under the sun, whether it's virtual group meetings or in-person group meetings, or there's an enrollment firm involved and we need to educate the counselors, or we need to plug videos into the Ben admin or flyers into the payroll stuffers, or
it just regular line of communication needs to be open, right? And a recurring line of communication.
Correct. Yeah.
How far in advance? 60, 90 days in advance, or what?
We've had some large employers that have said we're going to make the move 6 months ahead of time, and we'll start the pre-open enrollment communication 6 months ahead of time.
Okay.
And it doesn't stop at open enrollment. It's perpetual. It's not a set it and forget it plan. And I think that's where the problems arise is, you know, a broker that's never done it before and they're used to just doing, even if they're self-funding with a network, it's pretty streamlined, and they have to understand that this requires active plan management to make it go well.
Yeah.
So.
Well, that's it. I mean, there's no such thing as a free lunch, right? You can't just flip a switch and save 40% on your plan without some effort, or, you know, breaking a few eggs, if you will, to make that omelet. But I want to talk about the actual, let's drill down to the actual kind of member level where I need a procedure. So let's pick a procedure that is scheduled, like a knee operation or something very relatively routine. How do I go about navigating the system so that I know that my claim will be paid and I'll be happy as an employee? This podcast is sponsored by PlanSight. PlanSight is a technology for employee benefits brokers to more efficiently manage their RFP process for any group size, all funding types, and over 20 benefit lines and point solutions. PlanSight is the only end-to-end RFP technology on the market today. Let's modernize your RFP process together. Check us out at plansight.com.
Yeah. So Spencer needs his meniscus redone. And he's already seen his primary care doc, who's referred him into an orthopedic surgeon. The orthopedic surgeon's done the MRI and has determined you need surgery. That orthopedic surgeon's office knows that surgery requires prior authorization. And so they call the pre-cert company that's on the ID card. It's the same one that would be attached to any of your PPO plans. And they just verify medical necessity, verify eligibility, benefits, and your surgery's scheduled and on you go. If the patient intake people at the facility have any questions about reimbursement, or they say, hey, this is an out-of-network claim, we need an agreement, ClaimDOC has a provider relations team on standby. So on standby, the way you would think of a TPA being on standby to take provider calls, we have a provider relations team on standby to negotiate single case agreements when those type of things pop up. And so we would get on the phone with hospital administration and say, this is an open access plan with no network. Here's how we typically pay. Does this work? If it doesn't work, let's negotiate a fair and reasonable agreement so that Spencer can get his knee surgery without any delays.
Yeah.
Most of the time, that's a fairly smooth process. When it's not, it's not. And now it's all, I keep saying all hands on deck. It's all hands on deck to make sure that if we do have to reroute you to another facility, we'll go as far as calling your doc and saying, hey, doc, XYZ hospital's not being very agreeable to this procedure. Do you have admitting rights at another place? Can we get him in there? And that's how we go about doing that.
Sure, yeah. But I mean, so let's talk about the provider side of the equation, right? Because what is it in your mind, what is the benefit to a provider from saying yes to a ClaimDOC in the way that you pay? Like, I'm sure there's multiple benefits that you could point to.
Yeah, it's a simpler process. It's a faster payment. Oftentimes it's a higher payment if we're talking about physicians. And we talked about this at coffee earlier, but the primary care providers have been getting squeezed. And
absolutely.
Most people don't realize that the docs are getting Medicare plus a markup, whether they're getting paid by Blue Cross or United or Cigna or Aetna, and we pay docs Medicare plus a 25% markup. The networks are paying them less and less and less, to the point where I believe the Dallas area is like 103%.
103% of Medicare?
If you look at a blended commercial payer average.
Wow. So that actually begs my question, which I've had before, which is Medicare priced too low and the private sector is having to actually supplement Medicare because it's not enough payment, right? Do you think that's happening, or do you actually think it's a fair reimbursement rate? Broadly, right? It's on average, right?
Yeah, broadly. Yeah. I think that's the argument that the large health systems would try to make, is that they're losing on Medicare. My argument back would be that maybe they need to tighten their belt if they can't make money on Medicare. And I get that it's claim by claim, but I'll give you an example. Like, we rarely see any pushback on dialysis claims.
Okay.
Because dialysis, the overwhelming majority of their care is for seniors that are Medicare participants. And so they make really healthy profits off of a flat Medicare rate. And so, I get that maybe a rural hospital could say that because they're losing population and they're struggling financially. But if you're a big system in a big market, you're going to have a really tough time selling me on the fact that you can't at least break even off Medicare. And I would need to see the salaries of all your executives before you tell me that Medicare is not a break even, because any nonprofit hospital who's got a bunch of executives making seven figures, okay, well maybe that's why Medicare is not enough for you. Yeah. But and I'll give you another example. I own a home health agency, and our break-even point on Medicare managed care is like 70% of Medicare. So, it's really funny that the networks are really good at managing costs for the government because they're incentivized to, and they're really bad at managing costs for commercial plans because they're not incentivized to.
Right.
It's a really easy math equation
to see.
Well, again,
it speaks back to, and I've heard that 30 to 40% delta. The folks that came on and talked about the Consolidated Appropriations Act and compliance last year suggested there might be a 30 to 40% margin built into the system that was unnecessary, right? That's really where we can attack. So it's no surprise to me that that's kind of a similar range that you're seeing. I mean, I've seen, forensic audits and things like that where they're finding 20+% just in looking at the bills and adjudicating them after the fact. So I would suspect that we've got that amount of margin built into our system that is unnecessary in the grand scheme of things. So could Medicare then be the appropriate reference point? It probably actually is, if I had to guess.
Yeah, I read an article on LinkedIn just the other day that talked about, it was a broker talking about how he's transitioned one of his reference-based pricing clients to a flat Medicare. That's a little scary from just in my opinion, from my perspective, because I don't know what the differential and pushback would be. We pay facilities Medicare plus 25 or cost plus 20, whichever is greater, line by line. And so we know that's a fair payment. We're never paying less than cost plus 20 or Medicare plus 25. So we can defend that as fair and reasonable. A flat Medicare rate, as aggressive a person as I am, that would scare me.
That's even a little scary for you. Well, what about let's kind of zoom out. We went down to the case level. Let's look like big picture stuff though. Do you have a sense or do you have any insight of how common is a reference-based pricing or an open network arrangement across the board, across the country? Is it still relatively a niche thing today?
I don't know the number.
Okay.
I know for a fact it's less than 5% of even self-funded plans.
Okay, really? Okay.
It's small.
So what do you think is holding back getting this to sort of critical mass to be a lot more common?
I think a lot of it is held at the consultant level. We don't do much business with the big consultants out there. We do a lot of business with the small independents and some with the mid-market shops. But I think they've grown accustomed to the network status quo and those guys, let's face it, brokers, a good broker makes a lot of money.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And so getting them to do anything different is a challenge, and getting them to do something that's likely going to place a higher workload on them for the same amount of revenue, that's a real challenge, even if it's the right thing to do for the client. And I know, nobody would sit here and admit that they're not going to do the right thing for the client, and I would hope that they all would, but
well, the incentive structure incentivizes them to not necessarily do this, right? Unfortunately. So I guess we would beg the question, how do we make sure our consultants are still making a good living, that their agencies are still thriving, they're still able to provide the resources for their clients to do their job as advertised, but then incentivize them in a way to really look at things that are more beneficial to the employer's bottom line?
Yeah, I think from ClaimDOC's perspective is we try to alleviate as much of that workload as possible with our member advocacy and our account management and implementation. So we try to be that resource they can lean on. Inevitably, they're going to have to get involved, and it is more hands-on. But there's a lot of innovation out there that these consultants just aren't taking true advantage of that can make RBP run a lot smoother. And I'll give you a perfect example that I love: direct primary care. When you go to an employer and say, let's take all these claims off the table and let's pay for them on a subscription basis, and now all of this care for your entire population becomes free, no copay to your people. That's a huge value add benefit to the member.
Yeah, absolutely.
That they love. And I've sat in open enrollment meetings and I've watched people cry over benefits like this. And it's just so underutilized and underappreciated by the consultant community that it's really hard to fathom.
Do you see DPC and RBP combined often though? I mean, I think that's a pretty heavy 1-2 punch.
It's amazing, and it's funny you say that because I just led a panel at the Benefits Pro conference that was dedicated to DPC and RBP, and the title of the breakout session was "A Match Made in Heaven?" ?
Yeah.
And I had a broker who's done a lot of combo DPC RBP speak, and I had a physician CEO who runs a DPC practice out of Chicago participate, and it was attended by 300 consultants probably. So I think it's going to continue to grow, and I'm pushing it hard, and I'd like to think that ClaimDOC is out at the forefront on the RBP side with partnering with these DPC solutions, because the real magic happens when that care needs to go outside of the four walls of the DPC, and the care coordination team at the physician level works hand in glove with my member advocacy team to make sure that specialty care goes to an RBP friendly specialist.
I mean, again, if you're set up and maybe you're arranged in a certain way, your population is maybe heavily concentrated in one location, which would certainly help to stand up DPC and then add RBP on top of it. But if you were one of those employers that situation was the case, I mean, I would strongly take a look at those in conjunction, even if you don't do them in the same year, right? You might look at it as too disruptive to do in the same year, and people always use that crawl, walk, run metaphor to suggest let's do it over the course of time. But man, I could see that would just be a powerful cost-saving combination.
It smokes. Let me tell you, and for large employers, what I've seen some of them do is use one location as a beta site, and then the other side to that is there's now virtual DPCs, there's now DPC aggregators, I work with a group down in Houston that they built their DPC practice out of urgent care clinics. So they've got 30 urgent cares in Houston, 7 or 8 more in Austin, 7 or 8 more in San Antonio. And so now if you're an employer that has people in Houston, Austin, San Antonio, Beaumont, you sort of have them as your safe harbor for primary care, pediatrics, urgent care. It's a really strong offering, and it's priced really well too.
Well, let's kind of zoom back out to big picture, and I want to ask this question. This is more speculative in nature, but do you think RBP will ever be the norm, or will it always still sort of be only a situational use that some employers deploy? Like, could you ever see it being the most common way to pay claims?
No. I think that was the government's intent with Obamacare, was to get to a single payer system where there was one established payment method for everybody, and the federal government didn't even come close.
Okay.
So I think there'll be a system where there's a more cost-effective way to do it, and it'll be a hybrid of RBP and what we know now today as the PPOs. So,
well, you said you guys are doing a little of that, right? Where like people can have a dual option in certain situations to pick which ones they prefer.
Yeah. So we've done them in the past with certain TPAs and the Cigna network, and we now have the ability to do it with UMR and the United network. And so what happens is at open enrollment, the member gets to choose: do I want the United Healthcare plan with a $2,000 deductible for $200 a month, or do I want the ClaimDOC plan with a $2,000 deductible for $130 a month? And the first one we did, we suspected we'd get half to 3/4 of the population. And what happened on our first case was 6 people in the group took United Healthcare and 350 took ClaimDOC.
Holy cow. I
mean, that really said something to us, because the rank and file employees, the working class America, they need.
Well, I say,
they need the
in
bump.
your example, $75 a month savings is a notable savings, and they might go, "Oh, this thing sounds pretty cool, and I'll play ball. I'll figure it out. If I get to save $75 a month on my premium, I mean, that's you shouldn't scoff at that, right? And it's not. We shouldn't suggest that sort of delta wouldn't be just enough to make people choose one or the other.
Well, and that's the other issue, is that, we're all a bunch of high flyers, like high level brokers, CFOs, even HR executives. They make plenty of money, and we maybe don't always put ourselves in the chair of the entry level manufacturing guy who makes $18 an hour and has a family to support.
Yeah.
I still do open enrollment meetings because I want to know how the people are perceiving this, and seeing a single mother cry over her DPC benefit 'cause she didn't have to pay her copays anymore, or seeing a burly truck driver cry because he's going to save literally $700 a month on his family coverage.
Yeah.
He thought I was lying to him, and then started crying when he realized that that's how much money he was going to save. That's real money.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so, that's something that I would urge the entire industry to think more about, is who you're taking care of. Is it the big health system, the big insurance company, or is it working class America?
Yeah. Well, that's just it. I mean, it's once you mentioned earlier, when you kind of discovered this, you were sold, right? I remember when I discovered self-funding 10 years ago, was sold. I literally went back after a seminar. I was still employed at my previous company and in the finance department. I'm like, have you guys heard of this self-funded stuff? It's so cool. And it was just like I had seen the light. And then I knew that if I just sort of like leaned into that and dedicated, my focus on that, I knew I was kind of on the right side of things, right? And so when you see the situations that you're describing, that just reinforces that you're doing solid work, man.
Yeah, I mean, my priority is to take care of my family, and be a positive influence on my community, and my community is anybody that I come into contact with, and I'm able to do that to a certain extent through my work. And so it's hard, but it's fulfilling for sure.
I love it, man. Well, Omar, why don't we wrap things up? I'll leave you just kind of the closing thoughts. The floor is yours. Anything you want to say before we part ways?
Yeah, it was truly an honor to be here. As you know, we're going to be a long-term sponsor.
Yeah, I know. I forgot to bring that up, man.
No,
I wanted to find a good way to segue that in, man.
I'll slide it in at the end.
Yeah, okay, go for it.
Yeah, just the fact that your other 2 long-term sponsors are your employer and your former employer, that told me everything I needed to know about the value that I was going to get out of this. So we're happy to be a part of it and love the work you're doing. So thanks, man.
Well, I appreciate that. And, we had this booked probably 3 or 4 months ago, but things materialized since then. And I do appreciate you guys' faith in what I'm doing here. I'm happy to bring you into this ecosystem and make you a formal partner of the podcast. And I'm very much looking forward to what that's going to bring for both of us.
Awesome. Thanks,
man. My pleasure.